James, we've been friends since our early 20s, getting near 40 years now, and back then we talked about the purpose and meaning of life and what we are as human beings, and is there an afterlife? And in this 4 decades or so, you've built a wonderful career, become one of the world's leading experts in the early church history and Judeo-Christian history, while I've done all sorts of other strange things. So, but I've still continued to
You keep thinking about it.
Continue all the time. And so I really come to you as an old friend and to tell me, what have you learned during these decades when I've been off wandering in some other worlds?
I think I'm going to have to give you a history lesson.
I'm ready for it.
Lots of times historians clarify, but they don't always answer. But we'll try to get close to the truth if we can, just by looking at history of ideas. With my students, I like to begin with the Bible. You know, it's the document of the West. And what they assume is that eternal life is all over the place in the Bible. You're going to open it up. It's basically about eternal life. And most of my students are coming from Christian backgrounds. But the surprising thing about the Bible is the first story we've got, the Garden of Eden, as we understand it historically at least, it's a story about how humans are not going to get eternal life. Remember, Adam and Eve are expelled from the garden. There's an angelic guard at the gate, lest they should eat and live forever. Now that's tantalizing because you think, well, maybe they will later. But as you read on, the story, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, these people die. Nothing's said in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, about them going to heaven, about them being raised from the dead. And what we're finding now historically is fascinating, that all over the ancient Near East and the Mediterranean world, other cultures have the same view. This is not just something the Hebrews had. That you die, you go into the underworld. The Hebrews called it Sheol. The Greeks called it Hades. But if you go to Homer, the most ancient Hebrew tradition, Odysseus is grieving over his lost friend Achilles, who's died. And he wants to visit him. And so he calls him up like through a seance. And Achilles exists. He has a sort of afterlife, but it's a shadowy existence. If you remember the story, he has to give him a little blood to kind of pump him up, because blood is life, blood is this world. And then Achilles gives him the bad news. He said, I would rather be a servant in the world above than a king down here in the world below. Now, he's not in hell. It's not that he's getting tortured. It's that these ancient peoples, the Hebrews, the Greeks, the ancient Babylonians, you remember the Gilgamesh epic?
Many people say that is the real story of the Bible, and the Bible took from Gilgamesh.
You know, it's possible the Bible did draw from it, but it in a sense tells the same story. It's this great adventure story where Gilgamesh, the hero, is grieved over the death of a friend, and he goes on a search for immortality. He's traveling and so forth. He's told along the way by this barmaid, where he's stopping for a drink, your quest is vain. You're never going to find it. Basically, humans die, they go down to the world below, and that's it. He finds finally this plant, and he's told if he dives down in the water and gets it and eats it, he will live forever. Very similar to Genesis, but guess what happens? He's so tired from the dive, he falls asleep, and a snake comes along and eats the plant. He wakes up and it's gone. So we're getting these stories throughout the Bible, ancient Near East, Greeks, about you're not going to get it, there's no eternal life. Sort of amazing to think about.
So in most of the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, the concept of an afterlife is...
It's shocking, it's not there. You know, and people just assume, well, all these good folks that serve God must have lived forever. And do you realize in the Torah that Moses was given, there's not one word ever?
The first 5 books of the Bible.
You will have eternal life, or you'll go to heaven when you die. The earliest example I can find, very interesting archaeologically, little gold foil in Greek tombs by the ear of the deceased, and it's a little prayer for the dead. And what they say is that the soul, when it goes into the underworld, has hope of going to heaven. But that's about the earliest in Greek thought. Now, in the Hebrew Bible, I think of one passage in the entire Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, and that's the book of Daniel,
Right.
that says, in the future, many of those who sleep in the dust will arise, some to everlasting life. And that just pops out of nowhere, but really not out of nowhere. There's a great persecution going on, and we can reconstruct, I think, what's happening, where people are beginning to ask a different question. Is life fair? And if individuals die for their faith as martyrs, as they did during this period, we call it the Maccabean period. It's about 200 years before the time of Jesus. They die as good people, and the people that apostatize and curse God and so forth do fine. How can that be? And so Daniel says, no, those people will come back. During the time of Jesus, it's still a controversy. Remember the Pharisees and Sadducees? Right. He apparently believed in resurrection of the dead, which is a version of this, that the dead will come back at some point. But a whole group of rabbis at that time, we call them Sadducees, said, no, that's that new idea that the Greeks have brought in. We don't accept that. So they're disputing it. And yet you come to the New Testament, and particularly Paul, it's absolutely built on the notion of immortality and eternal life. And yet that book we call the Bible, with the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament is put together. And it could be seen as a development.
So is what we're dealing with a development where we have a growth in understanding, or is it some artificial amalgamation of radically different concepts?
I think it's the latter. I don't see, development implies that it was meant to go in a certain way, a kind of a revelation. Yeah. I think it's actually an intrusion. The Hebrew view from start to finish of the Old Testament has a consistency to it. It might not be satisfying to someone who believes in Paul and his message, but it was to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Moses. They didn't complain about it. And I think what happens is Greek thinking begins to, I'll use the word infiltrate, and I don't necessarily mean that negative, but just to come into Hebrew thought. Socrates is a great example. He's 4th century BC, and before any Jews are thinking of immortality, eternal life, he's already saying, heaven is our home, I drink the hemlock, and I'm better off than you. Weep for yourselves, don't weep for me, I'm going to where I belong. And I think that becomes such a seductive view for the Western world. Maybe we could explain it by a sort of historical sense of being tired with the tragedy, the injustice, what we call theodicy. Does the world make sense? Does history with all of its convolutions make any sense?
So you see this as something that's coming in after most of the Hebrew Bible has occurred in the Maccabean or the intertestamental period, and then flourishing in the New Testament and coming into its full regalia with Paul in terms of his afterlife.
I would call it Hellenization. Yeah. Now, where did the Greeks get it?
There are some things in the Old Testament, like the Ezekiel with the bones rising up. There are some other hints of it. Enoch not being taken away. I mean, there are some things in the Old Testament that hint at an afterlife. I think you'd have to say that.
Well, they're very minimal. Like the idea of Enoch going away and not dying is an exception. Gilgamesh has that too. You have this Noah character that's off somewhere in the Isles of the Blessed, but it's not the fate. So the concept, it's not the fate of everyone. The concept is there, but I really don't think that it's a systematic understanding of the Hebrew view.
Is this an issue? We're dealing with the concept of an afterlife, but there are two radically different kinds of afterlives. One is that we are an immortal soul, that we have an inherent immortality in us, and so when we die, we're going to go home like Socrates. The other is this concept of a resurrection, whether a bodily resurrection or some kind of something in the future, but when you're dead, and that God at some time in some unknown future can resurrect. Now, both are an afterlife, but they have radically different characteristics.
Right.
Does that help us understand the Hebrew Bible?
It does, because that resurrection idea was ridiculous to the Greeks. Why would you want to resurrect the shell, the prison, Socrates called it,
Right.
and bring that back? You've escaped and gone to heaven.
Right.
Now, the Hebrews are sticking more with their heritage. Death is death. Death is not life. If you die, you go to this underworld Sheol. So the question comes, could God raise the dead? Could God bring back the dead? And certain Jews in the first century and 100 years or so before Jesus began to say, yes, he could. Then they've got to have a huge debate over, well, how would that happen? And what kind of a body would they come? And what would it look like? And of course, the Greeks are at the sideline making fun of that.
Right. Why do you need any of that?
Yeah, are they still going to go to the toilet? Are they going to, fly around and have wings and so forth? And Paul gives a kind of definitive answer for Christians, at least. He says, that's a foolish question. God will give them a body as appropriate to them. And that's sort of been what Christians have stayed with for centuries now.
Well, but Christians sort of have both, at least in the tradition. They have the immortality of the soul and they have a resurrection. So that in the Christian religion, at least traditionally, you have both.
Yeah, see, I'm an early historian, so I stay with Paul. He's clearly resurrection. What happens is, as centuries go on, people go back to the idea of an immediate afterlife. You bury a loved one. It's fine to talk about someday, at the last great day, grandma will come forth from the grave. But I think the preachers also begin to say things like, no, grandma has gone right now to be in heaven with God.
Makes you feel better.
Makes you feel better, but it's a huge philosophical problem.
And it's
because
certainly
if she, her essence, is in heaven, then why do you even need to worry about resurrecting a body? So I think resurrection as a original Hebrew Christian concept is completely lost with most people who are even Christians or Jews today. They don't really mean what ancient Christians meant by resurrection. And that's the reviving somehow of the complete self, body, soul, and spirit.
Yeah, and that's
almost like a DNA replication with the consciousness coming back. And maybe in some immortal form that won't die, but still the whole self, not a soul off in another realm.
Because if you have a soul, why then do you need a resurrection?
Why do you need a resurrection? Right. I think what you get basically in this 2,000-year spread from Abraham to Jesus, let's put it that way, is in the ancient Hebrew, ancient Greek even, no afterlife at all. Just an acceptance that the dead go down to Sheol, to Hades, and they never come back. And then by the time of Jesus, you've got this intense debate that maybe humans are immortal and they actually dwell in heaven. The Hebrews are holding back on that, I think. They're saying, now wait, they're down in the underworld, but could God perhaps bring them back in some form? And that's not really settled in the time of Jesus or Paul, early Christianity. I think those options are on the table, and the church has a long way to go to try to work that out. And I would say they never really do adequately. It just remains a problem.